Resource projects that never were, and those taken apart.
These are all projects that don't emerge in the way that they were intended to emerge into the world as. They're abandoned, they're left half built, they're dissolved after the usefulness doesn't sort of come to fruition. And so the idea of the unbuilt environments, that even these unbuilt projects have profound effects on the way people understand and engage with the environment.
An interview with Jonathan Payton about his new book, Unbuilt Environments, tracing post-war development in Northwest British Columbia. I'm Sean Courage, and you're listening to episode 63 of Nature's Past, a podcast of the Network in Canadian History and Environment. Environmental historians of Canada have written a lot about resource development. Hydroelectric dams, mines, forestry, oil and gas extraction. Resource development histories can tell us much about the changing relationships between people and the rest of nature in an industrial economy driven by the exploitation of natural resources. If we think about the Staples thesis and the work of Harold Innis, one could argue that resource development histories have a long legacy in Canadian historiography in general. But what can we learn about human-nature relations by studying resource projects that failed? Those that were halted partway, those that were stopped before any construction, and those that fell apart after years of extraction. Jonathan Payton refers to these resource development stories as unbuilt environments in his new book from UBC Press, Unbuilt Environments, Tracing Post-War Development in Northwest British Columbia. With a focus on British Columbia's Stikine watershed and region in the second half of the 20th century, Payton looks at case studies of resource development failures, including mining, transportation infrastructure, hydroelectric dams, and more, to reveal the environmental consequences of the projects that never were and those that fell apart.
I'm Jonathan Payton. I'm at the University of Manitoba. I'm an associate professor here, and I'm in the Department of Environment and Geography.
Thanks for joining us, John. We're here to talk about your book from last year called Unbuilt Environments. And I think maybe a good place to start for listeners is to situate them geographically. So maybe if you could just take a moment to tell us a little bit about the environments of Northwest British Columbia that you write about in your book, where these places are, and what they're like.
Sure, thanks, Sean. So the book takes you to the sort of northwest quadrant of BC. It's a huge swath of territory, vast plains and plateaus, grasslands, kind of punctuated with some iconic landscapes. It's the area roughly between the coastal mountains and the Cassiar and Amaneka mountains, and the area in between is just, as I said, a series of plateaus. The kind of standout landscape is the landscape that surrounds the Stikine River itself. There you have the Grand Canyon of the Stikine. It's a beautiful, extraordinary landscape with these precipitous cliffs that drop off to the river. And over the course of the 20th century, the Stikine, which is sometimes called Cassiar country, has really been the site of a whole bunch of different attempts at extraction, either big game hunting in the early decades or metals and minerals, and then energy economies more recently. Your listeners might be most familiar with an area that has come to be called the Sacred Headwaters. The Sacred Headwaters is the area where the headwaters of the Stikine, the Naas, and the Skeena rivers all begin. And over the past 20 years, it's been the site of a couple of really fierce and protracted debates over coal bed methane extraction and an anthracite coal deposit, which residents have successfully managed to push off. So, that describes Northwest BC.
I guess one thing when I was reading the book was, I knew this, but I didn't think about it, but that the region is, sits on the border of the Yukon and Alaska. So it's got
That's
an
right.
international border as well, which plays into some of the stories that you tell in the book.
Hmm. Yeah, the international border is interesting. There's obviously jurisdictional issues. There are issues that come up in the book in terms of the spatial relationship between Indigenous peoples and different states.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that equation that you're talking about there also refers to the kind of long geographies of these development projects that we deal with there. The scale that we're dealing with, the distances that stuff has to travel to get into and out of the Stikine, is also a marker of what happens in the book.
Mm-hmm. Now, most British Columbians and most Canadians live in the South, in a handful of cities. This is a part of the provincial North that very few people have been to, particularly the settler population of the province of British Columbia and the rest of Canada. So why, from your view, was this an important place to try and understand its history?
Yeah, you're right. Very few settler populations don't normally visit, and part of that is because it's relatively inaccessible. Up until a few years ago, the main road, Highway 37 or the Stewart-Cassiar Highway, wasn't even paved. So part of the reason why I think it's important to talk about places like the Stikine is that the Stikine itself, or Northwest BC, is kind of a microcosm of post-war development in an out-of-the-way place, in a place that we can sort of conceive of as a marginal place or a frontier. And so it's a place where we can see the aftermaths of attempts to bring benefits of industrial modernity to a place that has had sort of variable encounters with modernity and with the industrialization that's characterized most of the post-war world. Mm-hmm. And so we can see how these attempts to use nature and development as vehicles for improvement, both of landscapes and of peoples, have had pretty profound effects on a landscape. At the same time, I think we can see here in places like the Stikine the persistence of Indigenous cultures, the persistence of Indigenous economies in ways that continue to this day.
So in some ways, it's emblematic of other places within Canada that Southerners have designated as resource frontiers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that a lot of the attempts to improve the Stikine or to bring industrial modernity to the Stikine result in failure, but that this failure is actually, it's productive. It is productive of new environmental knowledge, and it's productive of new ways of thinking about the environment. It's productive of new ways of thinking about landscape. And one of these important ways is the marking of the Stikine as exactly what you're saying, as a resource space instead of a place of nature, a place of place of wilderness, whatever word you want to use. It becomes a place where resources exist and can be extracted from.
So this is, in some sense, one of the central concepts of the book, the unbuilt environment. So I thought that might be a good place for us to begin a richer conversation about the arguments you make in this book, is to ask you to define unbuilt environment, because, of course, you have many stories of unbuilt environments in this book.
Yeah. Built environment, it's a flexible concept. I like to sort of think about it. I say this in the book. I think about it as a heuristic for thinking about the effects of development projects, the side effects of development projects over space and time. These are all projects that don't emerge in the way that they were intended to emerge into the world as. They're abandoned, they're left half built, they're dissolved after the usefulness doesn't sort of come to fruition. And so the idea of the unbuilt environments, that even these unbuilt projects have profound effects on the way people understand and engage with the environment. This this, I make the argument in the book, and this is central to the book, is that unbuilt environments can be material. You can see the effects of an unbuilt dam, or you can see the effects of a drilling regime onto a territory. These effects are also discursive. You can see the effects of an unbuilt dam, for instance, in the production of different kinds of environmental knowledges on a landscape. And you can see it in the way that those environmental knowledges circulate, both through people on the land in the communities of the Stikine, but also in metropolitan communities where that environmental knowledge gets used in different ways.
Yeah, and there's multiple types of unbuilt environments in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Two that stand out are the projects that are partially built and not
Mm-hmm.
completed, and the resource projects that are closed down and sort of semi-deconstructed in a sense. So you have the Cassiar asbestos mining as a kind of decommissioned northern resource project, and then you have the Dease Lake Railway extension as an unfinished project. Do you see distinctions between those two types, I guess, coming at unbuilt as a concept from two different directions?
Yeah, there are certainly material differences. Cassiar is this amazing example of a place that was a functioning, fully fledged community for 40 years between 1952 and 1992, when a series of financial and engineering failures, sort of conspired to close the town. In the early 90s, people were given 4 months to find another place to live before the electricity and the water was shut off because it was a company town. So the failure in a place like Cassiar can be pretty easily diagnosed as a set of effects that wind up causing failure. In terms of Dease Lake, it's a different kind of failure, given that it's one of these kind of infrastructure projects, the kinds of infrastructure projects that we see all the time that have spiraling costs associated with them, also all sorts of engineering mistakes and failures, and different kinds of environmental effects on the landscape. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's extraordinary about examples like Dease Lake, and to a lesser extent Cassiar, is that you can see the effects of failure being reproduced on the landscape all the time. And you can see these manifest in contemporary effects to use the same pieces of infrastructure. So, with the Dease Lake extension, there's talk of using that rail bed, 700 kilometers of rail bed that still exists, moving south to north through northwest BC, as a piece of the infrastructure to connect Alaska by rail through British Columbia to the lower 48 states. In terms of Cassiar, there's 16 million tons of waste rock that exists in the middle of an alpine valley in the Cassiar Mountains. And you can, there's been a whole bunch of attempts to extract materials from that site. The tailings pile is apparently super rich in molybdenum. So there was an attempt about a decade ago to ship the tailings pile to Korea for further milling. There's also been, some of your listeners may have seen jade fever on the Discovery Network, where folks are up in the mountains around the town of Jade City, near the former town of Cassiar.
Right.
Getting into all sorts of hijinks around the mining of jade.
You wrote a little bit about this in one of the opening chapters of the book. Really nice, vivid description of driving up to Cassiar and seeing the tailings mountain kind of rise up over the horizon, and encountering, I guess, what you thought were maybe jade miners in the area.
They weren't jade miners. They were prospectors, hard rock miners. They were, I don't want to give away too much, but I met a guy who shall remain nameless, who was pretty skeptical of me. I write about this in the book. He was pretty skeptical of me. He wanted to make sure I wasn't wasn't from this, as he says, I wanted to make sure I wasn't from the Sierra Club or something. Once he found out I was just a university researcher, he decided to take me on a tour through the town, which is locked up. It's closed, and there's some of the mining infrastructure still there, and a little bit of the town infrastructure is still there. When the town closed in the early 90s, most of the material of the town, the material infrastructure of the town was actually was sold off, was auctioned off to pay the debts of the company. And so pieces of the infrastructure wound up all over the world. There was the brand new school, which wound up in Hudson Hope in Northeast BC, which is a town that's involved in its own sort of prospective unbuilt environment in the shadow of the Site C Dam. The lighting infrastructure of the town was shipped to Seashelt. So if any of you go to the Sunshine Coast, you're getting a little piece of Cassiar right there.
Oh, wow.
Some of the mining infrastructure was shipped to Norway. So, but there's this kind of ghost-like presence in the town where you can still see, the flower boxes and the driveways of the towns that are of the houses that were raised when the company left.
So this book adds, I think, to some of the scholarship in mining history about deconstructed mining sites and their post-productive lives. But I think you go beyond that to look at this other type of development, like the Dease Lake extension or the LNG projects and the hydro projects that are either partially completed or get started and then fail at some point, which I guess in some ways places failure at the center of your analysis. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you reconceptualize failure as a historian and how you think the ideas that you put forward in this book could be used in other environmental histories to rethink failure?
Yeah, sure. In the book, I developed this. I do think a lot about failure, and I think probably an amateur psychoanalyst could have a field day with that. But what I wound up doing is I base it on this idea of what I call in the book the political ecology of failure, which is to say that the notion of failure produces difference. It produces different kinds of political and economic effects on the landscape. So it allows for thinking about failure both in terms of the kind of both in terms of the environmental dislocations that emerge out of failure, but also in terms of the social repercussions for people who live in that part of the world. Mm-hmm. It also allows for thinking about failure as something that is productive, failure as something that is future oriented. So I make the argument in the book that the failures are productive of future interventions into the landscape, and there's all sorts of different examples of how failure manifests many years after the abandonment of Cassiar, for instance, or the abandonment of the Western LNG project a little bit further south from the Cassiar, from the Stikine region near Prince Rupert. So, failure is future-oriented. Failure is productive, and it's also a kind of a way to move away from a cause and effect approach to the question of failure, which kind of sometimes gets manifested in environmental history under the paradigm of unintended consequences. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I want to try to deal with failure as a messy, iterative process. In this sense, it's vital for securing locations, as I was saying before, across Canada as a resource spaces. Failure becomes one of the central ways through which those resource spaces get allocated on the map. Mm-hmm. Whether that's through interventions in an environmental impact assessment, or through like mapping by the Geological Survey, or the itemization of caribou on a landscape, or archaeological sites, or whatever it is. It's the accumulation of knowledge which becomes the thing that produces both resource space and produces the conditions of possibility for future interventions in the landscape as well.
And the book does a good job, too, of showing how a regional study like this can reveal interconnections between failed development projects. So a railway project and a hydro project and an LNG project are not necessarily, all of which are incomplete or failed, actually do have interconnections that you show in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And part of that is, my training is equally as an environmental historian and a geographer. So part of what I think I'm able to do in the book is to show the importance of scale as a kind of relational concept. So, for instance, in that LNG chapter, a large part of the reason why the Western LNG project failed was because the company, the proponent, Dome Petroleum, at the time one of, if not the largest company in Canada, also had vested interest in extracting oil and gas in the Arctic, and they became so horribly overcapitalized that they were unable to bring the Western LNG project to fruition. It also was involved in securing guaranteed customers guaranteed customers for the gas in Japan, and those relationships played a huge part in the collapse of the Western LNG project as well. So there are sort of important local considerations for all of these projects, but in large part the reasons for their failure, although I'm loath to kind of like diagnose the reasons for failure.
Yeah.
But a large part of the reasons for their failure was the failure in the connections to elsewhere. It's the story in that respect is less about the Stikine than in the relationships that the Stikine has to other places.
So, I mean, I want to ask you about your views of resource development failures and what you saw in the case studies to some extent. But maybe just to finish off this thought about failure and the utility of this lens of analysis, do you think that there are lessons that other scholars who study northern environments that southern businesses have used as resource frontiers? Are there lessons here to be learned? Does the scholarship focus too much on the project that was built and misses all of the projects before that weren't built?
Yeah. The second part of your question, I think the answer from my perspective is, yeah, it is important as historians to, instead of thinking about a cause and effect relationship or a diagnosis of reasons for failure, it's important to think about how the conditions of possibility for that project were enabled. You just think about any individual project. There are small armies of environmental impact assessors and surveyors and technicians and archaeologists and everywhere else that marches into a landscape and itemizes its environmental conditions. Most resource projects never come to fruition in the sort of first attempt. There's always a series of attempts to produce those kinds of landscapes. Site C right now is a perfect example. I mean, there have been at least 3 serious previous attempts to build Site C, and it's only now, after 50 years of trying to do so, that they've successfully been able to get that off the ground, for better or worse. And you can be sure that a kind of more forensic accounting of the environmental information that's been used to show that the current version of Site C is economically feasible and economically feasible and environmentally attractive is material that was produced in the previous attempts to build Site C.
And I guess even for large scale infrastructure projects and resource development projects, even if they were, I guess, brought online immediately, there would have been multiple proposals
Hmm.
and only one of them is ultimately developed. So I guess there are these kind of shadow unbuilt projects for every project that's actually built. So I'm sure there are multiple versions of Site C that exist for the contemporary version of Site C, not even just the historical ones.
Sure, I think that's probably exactly right. And there are also, to continue the example of the Peace River, there are multiple other sites up and down the Peace River that will have been targeted by BC Hydro over the course of the past probably 60 or 70 years, that will have had all sorts of different kinds of proposals, different kinds of designs developed for it.
So I think this book is really useful for other scholars studying, political economy, political ecology, resource development, for sure. And there's a lot to be drawn from some of these central ideas around failure and unbuilt environments. I wanted to shift a little bit now to ask you about the process of writing the book. And ask if you could share some of the challenges that went into the research and production of unbuilt environments.
Yeah, sure. You know, it's the notion of unbuilt environments required me to sort of develop a way of thinking about failure that moved away from that cause and effect approach to history that has yielded, hugely important insights in Canadian environmental history. But I wanted to do something a little bit different. It also required me not to think about failure as a kind of just so story. There really was a danger that failure just kind of as an analytical concept just kind of wound up reproducing itself or became a counterintuitive way of suggesting that the past is always part of the future or something kind of trite and relatively meaningless like that. There was the danger of just, sort of collapsing into a kind of self-help or like a business management strategy that was like sort of suggesting that success is just the other side of failure or something like that. And that was also really something that I self-consciously needed to avoid because that's trite as well.
Right.
So there's those kinds of analytical dangers that were really persistently at the front of my mind. But there were also, dealing with failure and doing archival work. Failure as an analytical concept and trying to think about how that represents itself or can be seen in the archives is a challenging task, particularly when dealing with corporate archives, which I'm sure you and many others will know presents its own host of challenges.
Yeah.
But dealing with failure or trying to understand the appearance or see the appearance of failure in the archive was a real challenge as well.
Yeah, because you've got some documents in there where I think when I think about how you would study a large resource project's failure makes sense, like a commission or an inquiry, like in the case of the Dease Lake extension. And because that was a publicly financed corporation, you had access to that. And they were obviously introspective enough and wanted to have the public accountability to produce a report on what led to the failure. So I suppose that case study worked pretty well in the archive for you, right?
It kind of wrote itself.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So how are some of the other ways you access the corporate archive? Do you get the kind of echoes of the corporate archive out of the public archive?
For sure. Yeah. So I was really lucky that there's a huge and incredible archive of the Cassiar Asbestos Company housed at University of Northern BC libraries. So it's a tough archive to use because it is so sprawling and sort of itemized selectively, but there's a ton of really rich material there, most of which has yet to be gone through. So, if there are any honors or master students out there who are looking for a project, that's a heck of a project right there. crown corporations like BC Hydro, for instance, which I had to look at in order to write the chapter on the 5 dams on the Stikine and Niskit rivers. Lots of material for BC Hydro was available through the Ministry of Environment Library, which is in Victoria. There are ways to read. I never really got access to BC Hydro correspondence or anything like that, or any of the high-level decision-making stuff. But what I was able to do, I think, was to read failure as an outcome, as an effect of all of the different interventions in the landscape. So you get, volumes upon volumes upon volumes of environmental impact assessment, archaeological data, data on mountain goat populations or whatever it is, and you can see, if you take a step back from all of that, how it produced knowledge, and more importantly, how that knowledge circulated outside of the Stikine.
I think these are useful tips too for future researchers who are looking at resource development histories, and especially histories that deal with corporate histories. So you've got your crown corporations, and you've got your bankrupt companies that have to download their archives into public institutions. So there's another opportunity for access for historians, I guess. But you do talk about this in the book as well, about challenges working with corporate records and what you can get access to and what you can't. And I guess an important lesson, and probably every historian who has studied a crown hydro corporation knows this, that even crown corporations' records are not as easy to access as you might think.
Yeah. Yeah. We could go on and on about the difficulties of access corporate records, for sure.
Yeah.
One of the other things I can point out is that there were opportunities and challenges in working in the Stikine. It's the Tahltan people have lived in the Stikine, as they say, since time immemorial, and they themselves have archives. So part of that was a really rich opportunity to think alongside members of the Tahltan and thinking about the effects of development on their land. But it also presented a whole host of challenges, not least because during a change of leadership and government structure a couple of years before I got there, much of their community archives was sort of divvied up into and given to different members of the community. So it became a bit of detective work trying to track stuff down through community members as well.
Well, it's always good to get an opportunity to hear a bit of the behind the scenes on how these books in environmental history are made. I wanted to thank you for sharing a little bit more about your book, and I hope listeners get out there and get a copy of Unbuilt Environments. Thanks so much, Jonna.
Thanks, Sean.
Nature's Past is produced with support from the Network in Canadian History and Environment. This episode was made by Jonathan Payton and me, Sean Karash. Music for Nature's Past was licensed by Creative Commons. For details on the artists, please take a look at our show notes at niche-canada.org/Nature's Past, where you can also download new episodes, subscribe to the podcast with your favorite podcast player, and leave comments. You can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/Nature's Past. And you can always find out more about environmental history research in Canada from the Niche website at niche-canada.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Nature's Past.